Hi everybody, Shay here. Today, we're finally getting to it. I've been talking about it, and I finally have some free time, a whole day that I could dedicate to it. So today is the day. We are starting the Rational Recovery series, and this is video 1. So welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, I am Shay. I was in active addiction for 22 years. And my clean date is October 10th of 2016. So today is September 10th of 2020. That means I am 30 days away from being 4 years clean. And let me tell y'all, I'm very, very super excited about it. What have I been talking about? The Rational Recovery book. This is what I've been talking about. This is another program that you can do if you are not having success with the 12 steps. To be clear, I found this program recently, and when I started reading the book, that's when I started to understand that I finally had something that I could tell people that I was doing, as I found that I was already doing these types of principles in this program, which is why I am trying to use my channel to share this. I've talked to a lot of addicts that do not have success with the 12 steps. So this is something else, another option. Not to put down the 12-step program. I've seen it work for many, many people. I've seen it not work for many, many people. So this is just to have another option. So to start off my Rational Recovery series, today we're gonna go over the Rational Recovery book, and we're gonna go over the introduction. But to start off this, I want to read from you, an expert from the small book. The small book was developed and created by Jack Trimpey, as the Rational Recovery program was. And the small book was the first book that he brought out. We're gonna go through the history of the small book later on in the series. We're gonna touch on it a little bit later on in this video. However, I want to read the first 2 pages from this book to start off the Rational Recovery series, as it tells you a story. And this was a story that really, really hit home for me, and I wanted to share this story with you. So, from Jack Trimpey's The Small Book. You're bleeding, and the emergency room doctor informs you that you will undergo surgery requiring a transfusion. Relieved, you relax a little and remark that you have type RR blood. As he leaves the room, you overhear him order 2 pints of type AA blood for the surgical suite. You jerk upright, blood surging from your wound, and you correct the doctor. I said type RR, doctor. He returns to your bedside and he explains, don't worry, son, type AA will be fine and you'll be back on your feet in a short time. You will, however, require frequent transfusions of type AA for the rest of your life. Wouldn't it be better, doctor, if I were infused with my own blood type, you ask? No, not at all, he answers you. Yours is a rare type, and besides, that's all we have in stock. You'll be just fine. So off you go to the surgical suite, wanting to trust, needing to trust, to overcome your fear. Your understanding has always been that blood types don't mix. Has something changed, you wonder? Can I really assimilate this substance into my body to sustain health and life? Will I suffer side effects? Not being in any position to bargain, you decide to protect yourself. Clutching your tourniquet, you spring from your gurney and you run to the street and you hail a taxi. A police car stops and the officer sees you bleeding, waving your arm. He restrains you and he starts leading you back into the emergency room. No, please, you explain, and you explain about the monolithic blood bank. In that case, you're coming with me, he says. Siren on, you speed to the county hospital where you're detained for reasons of incompetence. Even so, you're relieved to have a fresh start at the problem, and you feel that maybe you'll survive to tell this story. But you've become weak, too weak to defend your point of view. The doctor comes into the emergency room, diagnoses you, and notifies the surgical suite. 2 types of type AA blood for the new patient, and you feel hopeless. You've never felt so low. You surrender your will and you pass out. When you wake up, you don't feel well. You can tell there's something very wrong. You seek the opinion of other doctors you can find, but the answer is always the same. Type AA is good for everybody. It does not matter who you are or what your opinion is. We know from long experience that this is the only thing that works. Your wish very much that your own type of blood had been provided, but underneath it all, you begin to see that you're probably wrong in the first place. Facing death and the expert opinions of so many, you come to accept that you had better submit to regular transfusions of type AA blood. After all, who are you to say what is right for you? That was the story I wanted to share with you guys, is that really hit home. And that's how I want to start off the Rational Recovery Series, video 1. So stay tuned as we go through the introduction of the Rational Recovery book by Jack Trimpey. Okay, so Jack Trimpey's Rational Recovery Program. So we're going to go through the introduction of the Rational Recovery book, which is a very good book to read, especially if you're having trouble with the 12-step programs, or if you're fresh out of recovery or fresh getting into recovery, anybody who's suffering with an addiction. This is a really good book for you. Even if you don't agree with everything that he has in the book, I believe it's a good read, and I truly do believe it will help people understand their addiction more. There's never been another book out there like it, and I don't think that there will be anytime soon. This book definitely has changed my life, you know. Like I said before, this is a book and a program that was introduced to me after I started this YouTube channel. The message has always been that the 12-step programs is saturating the recovery industry. When I was looking for help, when I truly was ready to have some solid help, and I've already been in and out of AA, NA, all of those type of 12-step programs, they just simply didn't make sense to me, and they didn't work for me, and they don't work for a lot of recovering addicts. So I went out on my own against what the program tells you, and for about 3.5 years, that's what I did. And I did what the 12-step programs would say was running my own program. So when I ran across Rational Recovery, I felt a little bit vindicated as to I finally had a word or a name. I had a program that I can offer up to people in those social situations where this comes up and they ask you what kind of meeting you go to. For example, I went to my doctor yesterday. Of course, you have to be honest with your doctor, and you have to tell your doctor about, you know, your addiction and what type of medications you're on. So this doctor knows that I was in active addiction for 22 years, and this doctor knows that I'm on a blind detox with the methadone. The nurse and the doctor asked me, well, what meetings do you go to? Or, you know, and this was that perfect situation where I finally had something to say. Oh, I don't do Narcotics Anonymous, or oh, I don't do Alcoholics Anonymous. I do Rational Recovery. And it felt good, and they actually started asking questions. Well, what is that? And I explained to them, cognitive-based program. It teaches you about your thoughts. That's the short answer. It felt good to finally have something that I can say to people in those types of social situations, like my story with the doctor. It's another way that I think it's important to get the word out there to other addicts, and maybe family members or friends or just any loved ones that may have somebody that is an addict in their own life, whether they're in active addiction or whether they've recovered or in the process of recovery. I want to break stigmas, and that's why I want to make this series. And this is the only way I know how to do that, is to vlog my life and to speak in front of a camera, and I taught myself how to edit. So this is what we got. So the Rational Recovery book was developed by Jack Trimpey, and the reason why I'm taking the time to go through the introduction of this book is Jack Trimpey and his wife created and developed Rational Recovery. So I feel it's important that we know who he is and the process that he took to develop Rational Recovery. So that's what this video is going to go over. I took a lot of time to put this script together, and I'm proud of it, to be honest with you. I'm really proud of this. You know, I've taken a lot of time, and I've taught myself everything that I know about editing and what I put into these videos. So if you can, and if you're new to my videos, please consider subscribing, comment, and share my videos, please. I really want to get this word out there, and I'm trying very hard to break stigmas, and I need your help to do it. So thank you. So Jack Trimpey, who's Jack Trimpey, and how did he come up with Rational Recovery? So Jack Trimpey was an alcoholic for about 20 years. And during this time and afterwards, he was also a professional social worker. Back in the 70s, and back when he was an alcoholic and going through his recovery journey, he also believed in the disease model concept of addiction, both personally and professionally, because remember, he was a professional social worker. In his 20s, he believed that addiction and alcoholism is a disease and that it was inherited and incurable, where the individual is powerless over their choice to either use or drink or not. And he referred all of his clients back then to Alcoholics Anonymous, as they had a reputation of being the only thing that worked. He was fascinated that people who suffer from addiction would continue to use in spite of the well-known trajectory of despair that we all know is lying ahead of us. So he claims in the book that he attended over 30 Alcoholics Anonymous meetings during his time of drinking and recovery. And he found that the program simply didn't make sense to him, much like I did. He's not a very group-oriented person, just like me. I'm very introverted. Nor is he inclined to discuss his personal problems with strangers, just like me too. And I said something about this in my very first video, I think, about how Narcotics Anonymous does not work for me. However, I feel like I need to redo that because cringe, am I right? He said that the program does not make sense to him. He's not a group-oriented type of person, and he's not inclined to discuss his problem with strangers. He also stated that although they say that Alcoholics Anonymous says that they are a spiritual program and not a religious program, he found that puzzling, as he said that they obviously was. He goes on to write about a gentleman that he met in the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings that, believe it or not, his name was Bob. He saw Bob as a very gentle and caring soul who was a loner and that was often absent from work. And Bob was a long-time member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And Bob drank episodically and for most of his adult years. And he was very well liked by those under his care because he was a sponsor and he was pretty high up in the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting from what I remember reading in the book. Bob would speak to Jack about his lifelong struggle to remain sober. Now, when Jack would question the Alcoholics Anonymous program about how he felt this being a religious program, his questions were met with, read the big book, it tells us all we need to know in order to live with our disease. And Jack saw Bob as being hopeless about himself and his life and his future. But he spoke highly about the Alcoholics Anonymous program, and all of this was just very confusing to Jack back then. So he did what the Alcoholics Anonymous program told him to do, and he read the big book. And he confirmed that his suspicion that AA was a religious program, as well as because he was well churched and he was well literatured in religious history, in religious literature. The big book mirrored those religious literatures throughout history. So when Jack would bring this up in his AA meetings, he was met with religion is not enough for people because ministers and priests needed more than what religion can provide them, and priests and religious people and ministers often came to the Alcoholics Anonymous program because of this. So AA is a program that's supposedly compatible with our religions and is a spiritual program. And Jack decided not to press the issue further, and because the common phrase of take what you like and leave the rest, because, well, they said so, right? That's what he did. Now, dropping the religious aspect of the 12 steps, he did take to the disease concept. And the disease idea clicked with him as it relieved him of all personal responsibility. Once accepting this idea as his own, he no longer felt that urge, and he no longer felt the urge that he needed to quit drinking, and it didn't make sense to him to keep beating himself up since he most likely inherited alcoholism. He was just doing what alcoholics do, because again, he believed in the disease model concept, and he believed that it was inherited, and he believed that it was incurable. That's how he relieved all of his personal responsibility. One night at a bar, as he was looking at the drink in front of him, he was having his own internal battle. And he thought about Bob from the AA meetings, and he thought he would rather die than having to live like that guy did. Rather die than having to live a life, because he thought that the alternative to AA and dying was to drink, which was perfectly acceptable since it came naturally to him anyways. Even as he saw himself in his own mind's eye laying in that proverbial gutter, he thought to himself, would that be him? And he slammed his drink. Then he thought, so this is how we are. A disease that makes us powerless over the desire to drink alcohol. Well, there were worse disease than this, and kept right on drinking. Drinking that drink seemed to prove just how powerless he was. It was one example of how powerless he is to act responsible. He believed that his desire to drink was irresistible, and that his own moment-by-moment drinking behavior was a symptom of something unknown and beyond his own control. He believed it would take something unknown and beyond his control to take care of the problem. As you can imagine, this didn't go over very well with his wife, Lois. Jack was told by AA that family members cannot be expected to understand until they accept that he has a disease. So he started to see his wife, Lois, as an outsider, just as AA taught him. And as a result, he started to get closer to the AA program. And he continued his desire to continue drinking. Although he knew something would have to eventually intervene or rescue him, he couldn't imagine anything from preventing him or deterring him from drinking. Jack grew up in a Methodist church, and as such, his belief about God was that he existed, but he is not expected to do any favors. His belief was that God is there to be recognized, honored, and worshipped in a spiritual way. When he brought this up in the AA meetings, he was told to read the big book again, which he did. Upon rereading the book, he was insulted again by his words, sophomoric fundamentalism, and grew even more concerned that the program has surpassed the great religions of the world in its ability to contend with addiction. The message then became clear to Jack. Surrender his critical judgment, his personal beliefs, and his self to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, or else he was doomed to jails, asylums, hospitals, and death. Struggling with the religious aspect of the program, one AA member suggested anything could be his higher power, not just God. She then suggested trying nature as a higher power. So he went and tried nature as a higher power and found that His appreciation for nature was heightened when he was drinking. Then, his next suggestion for a higher power was wisdom. So, Jack went and tried wisdom on for a higher power, and he found he doesn't have the wisdom to know wisdom from folly. Then, it was suggested to use the AA group as his higher power. And Jack described looking around the room at these group of people who he wouldn't even want to be friends with, let alone willing to use them as a higher power. To that, the final suggestion was to use himself as a higher power. He tried many higher powers, their suggestions, as well as his own, and failed every single time with keeping him sober. That was the point in which he thought to himself that the group was no longer thinking for themselves, that their spiritual program was more important to them than common sense or his problem. He was told by the AA group that he simply just wanted to drink and he wasn't ready to quit. He knew he wanted to stop, but he also knew that he wanted to continue drinking. When he told the group that he wanted to try quitting on his own, the AA group told him that if he doesn't turn himself over to a higher power, then he is in effect in denial, which is a symptom of his disease. He wanted to agree with them. Addiction simply is an incurable disease. He loved his disease for reasons he did not know even to himself. He just accepted that he was crazy and that if he could stop drinking on his own, he would. So he tried many different AA groups in many different cities, trying that location change, seeking one with a different flavor. There were some maverick groups which used psychological theories to, in his words, bolster the down-home religious concepts such as taking a moral inventory, making amends, but in his final analysis, they were just like the main groups. They were all convinced that they suffered from a disease that made them different from others, and they all believed they needed to attend group meetings or else they would fall off the wagon. He left AA at this point, and he never looked back. He continued to drink for many years, just as AA predicted that he would, and he continued his career as a social worker, and he drank pretty steadily during this time. As a social worker in those days, he had access to a multitude of resources, and yet AA was the only game in town. He tried going back to AA meetings sporadically during this time, just to see if maybe something has changed, either with himself or maybe even with the meetings. Neither the meetings nor himself ever changed. Looking back, he described his perception was shaped by society, by embracing a philosophy of addiction that fosters addiction. Finally, in around 1982, he had enough of his problems that came along with his drinking, and he decided that if AA was correct, then he would soon just perish and die. If he was correct and AA was not correct, then he alone was solely responsible for taking control and quitting altogether. He picked a time, and at that time, he did it. He quit drinking. He went about his normal life, just minus the drinking. And he says that quitting was the most difficult and gut-wrenching thing that he had ever did, especially during those first couple of months. He was constantly irritable, and he always yearned for a drink. Few people even noticed that he stopped drinking. And before long, he started feeling better. And he is starting to enjoy life again. He again considered going back to the AA meetings for a tune-up and to see if he would fit in now that he was sober. He never did return to the AA meetings. He decided that what his life Lois had been telling him was correct. He made himself physically dependent on alcohol that he needed to sustain his addiction by avoiding his own responsibility to stop drinking. He continued to drink in spite of the bad consequences because of the nonsensical idea that he was powerless to do so otherwise. He realized his attachment to his disease of relapse was a respectable way of planning to drink in the future. So, after 2 years, when it finally sank into him that he was never going to drink again under any circumstances, and that he could predict this with a very high level of confidence that his addiction was over, he finally saw himself as a normal, well-adjusted, healthy human being who simply did not drink alcohol. Self-discoveries, much like the one that Jack has, is more commonplace than you would think. Research has shown, even back when Jack wrote this book, that 40 to 70% of people who recover from a serious addiction do so without getting any help of any kind, including self-help and support groups. People do this all the time, and they're brushed away as not being a true alcoholic because they don't attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. Remember, Jack was a social worker during this time, and he was working at a county mental hospital. And he came across many people with addiction issues that continued to use, despite the negative consequences that their own judgments, help from people, help from professionals, treatment programs, and recovery group movements tell them. They struggled and relapsed over time, and they usually end up just getting worse. Like many others, they wanted to stop using, and on the other hand, they didn't. They rejected much of what the 12 steps had to offer, and also accepted many of its essential concepts. They believed they inherited an incurable, progressive, inherited disease, and that this set them apart from others. They believe that recovery is an extremely difficult, life-consuming undertaking that was dependent on moral betterment, serious self-searching, personal and spiritual growth, belief in God, prayer, and religion. So his patients, under this ideal, tried to accept the simple 12-step programs of powerlessness and surrender that was presented to them as not only the best way, but the only way to get better. Because of this, and try as they might, they just were not able to do so. Given their limited choices between the 12-step lifestyles and their addiction, oftentimes they preferred their addiction and chose to accept addiction as a way of life. I did this too during my 22 years of addiction. I think it was around the 10-year mark when I accepted that I had a disease of addiction and that it was inherited to me from my alcoholic father, and that it was an incurable, progressive disease, and that I had to live with it. And I accepted that as being a part of my life. About the halfway mark of my 22 years of addiction. Those patients, much like myself and much like Jack, were not sicker than others who do well in the 12-step programs. We're simply in the wrong program. Their misfortune was the 12-step game. The 12-step game was the only game in town back then. So Jack tried looking for other services that were not based on the disease thinking and the religious concept of AA. He called every hospital in a 200-mile radius asking for services for these patients. The people that he spoke with back then said, no other program works. AA is broad enough for all people. Those who do not wish to participate in a 12-step program, they aren't really trying, and they're not motivated, and they will just have to get worse before they get better. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Because it certainly does to me. So Jack and his wife Lois found this answer to be unacceptable. They decided to go to bat for people like us who simply wanted to recover from their addictions by using their own natural abilities. In 1986, he established and started the Rational Recovery self-help groups in Central Valley, California, and people started attending in increasing numbers. More and more people were reporting to him that before Rational Recovery, all roads of addiction recovery led to the 12-step program. Over time, Jack noticed that there was a lack of self-help literature to follow along with during these groups. So he started writing a series of essays that contradicted most of what was set forth in Alcoholics Anonymous' big book. Within 2 years, the essays were collected and organized into what we now know is the Small Book, which became a groundbreaking publication in the addiction field. The literature behind the book is the critical link behind the overall Rational Recovery program. It went through 3 self-published revisions before it was finally professionally published in 1992. Rational Recovery, it is an evolving organization, and it is a program that is flexible and that will accommodate what we learn along our way. The Small Book is the counterpoint to AA's Big Book, and the Rational Recovery Self-Help Network is from its inception is an imitation of the 12-step recovery movement. The Rational Recovery Book is a guide for people emerging from Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or addiction treatment of any kind. I have never seen any other written material that summarizes the vivid thinking and the vivid feelings of addicted persons other than this book. You can consider Rational Recovery as a second party to addiction care. It is based off the addictive voice recognizing technique, or the AVRT technique. This was not invented by Jack, nor did he synthesize it from existing theories or practices in the field of psychology. AVRT was taught to Jack directly by hundreds of his clients who have come through this program. By 1989, after several years of developing Rational Recovery organization, he had only a basic understanding of the technique. By 1991, he began to notice that he was rapidly gaining new insights into the AVRT technique beyond his own personal understanding. Participants gave him amazing descriptions of their own addictive voices. So their behaviors started to become understandable to Jack in a concrete and a multi-dimensional dynamic way. And that's how AVRT was born. When he began to present his understandings in a structural model of addiction, people felt greatly relieved to learn that they were not congenitally defective or diseased. There was hope being gained, and people found their confidence in their ability to control their own addictive behaviors and voluntarily end their own addiction. When I picked up this book, like I said before, this book changed my life, and I really want to share this with you guys. So this is going to wrap up the introduction to the Rational Recovery book. This is going to wrap up the first video of the series. Stay tuned. There's going to be more videos we're going to go through. On video 2, we're going to go through the first chapter, if not the second chapter. See if I can't consolidate it down to 2 chapters of video. But please let me know down in the comments what you guys think about the introduction that we went through of Rational Recovery. Are you currently in a 12-step program and not finding success? Did the story from the small book that I read at the beginning, did that resonate with you? What do you think about the disease model of addiction? Do you agree with it? Do you not agree with it? But ultimately, whether you agree with the disease model of addiction or not, do you agree that we are all ultimately responsible for our own behaviors and our own recovery? Because I, for one, do. So this is going to wrap it up for me now, but I'm going to see you guys in the next video. And don't forget, be the change in the world that you want to see.